Edwin Sabuhoro was a game ranger. It's 2005. He's in the Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda, and he realizes that they've got a huge problem. They're sitting on a time bomb. They've got a huge poaching crisis in the Volcanoes National Park, and the only way they're going to stop it is by thinking differently about the problem, perhaps providing an incentive rather than the patrols which aren't working, the fences that aren't working, the attempts to try and convince people who are starving, please stop poaching, because nobody's interested in that particular narrative. So he does what most business people do. He offers an incentive. And that incentive is to give the poachers an alternative. Sets up camps outside of the main reserve and encourages people to come into these camps, to come into these communities, and to develop communities around schools, around clinics. And suddenly, poaching levels start to drop. People start hearing about these communities that are forming on the borders of the national park. And suddenly people get a sense of hope and optimism about the future, a sense that they didn't have before. And poaching numbers plummeted, tourist numbers picked up. The Rwandan government supported this particular initiative. And to this day, the poaching issues in that part of the world have been sufficiently decreased to enable a sustainable future for these creatures. Because the people who were poaching, and there's Edwin, the people who were poaching didn't do it because they were bored, because they needed some sort of Sunday afternoon activity. They did it because they were starving. So Edwin, using business principles, the principle of incentive, is what I want to talk to today. You would think that this was incentive enough. Little children and everybody who works in any enterprise in the world, somewhere in their family has future generations who are growing up, who depend on their decision-making prowess. And you would think that this would be incentive enough. When Vladimir Zelensky became the president of Ukraine, he told officials, don't put my photograph up on the walls, put photographs of your children on your desk, and you will make better decisions for the future if you consider the implications for them than if I am staring over your shoulder. That, of course, is something that we wish CEOs of large corporations would do. And when I talk to activists in this particular sector, they're quite nonplussed by the fact that CEOs are not thinking this way. So how do we get them to change their view? Now, behavioral science will tell us that we are wired for the short term. We're wired for short-term gratification. We're wired for the now, not for the long term. If we're going to make sensible decisions, we'll take the path towards the lovely veg. But invariably, we're going to make poor decisions. And we're making poor decisions each and every single day when it comes to climate. It's very hard to lose weight. It's very hard to save for a long-term future. The best way to do it is through incentives. Because what was the first thing that happened when the power cuts started happening in Europe in 2022? The first thing they did was de-mothball coal-fired power stations. It was a perfectly natural reaction, of course, of governments around the world. Nobody wants your future voters to freeze half to death during an icy cold European winter, so they fired up the old coal-fired power stations. The coal industry, this moribund industry, was revitalized once again as we saw huge exports of coal all over the world. This was a huge step, but it also shows that we focus on the short term. We need to solve today's problems right now. We kick tomorrow's problems down the road. And the world is feeling the pain of that, of course, as well. Huge progress has been made over the last couple of decades. Huge work is being done by extraordinary and courageous activists, scientists. The climate community has been remarkable in drawing attention to the crisis. But I think it's pretty clear that it's not enough. The ESG movement, for example, is brilliant. It's noble. But it's turned into a tick box exercise of lip service and just really lies, deceit, and dishonor, frankly. Because you look at the MSCI, these are the big index generators, they create indices around the world. They've downgraded 31,000 funds, ESG funds, in the last couple of months because there's no way of measuring their integrity. Because there's no global standard on ESG. My ESG is different to your ESG, which is different to the CEOs who's incentivized on short-term profit goals ESG, and we can pay all kinds of lip service to it. So unfortunately, what we're doing right now is great. We're drawing attention to the crisis. We've done that now. How do we change outcomes? Now, I want to suggest to you that we can use business principles to play business at its own game. If you could tweak the business model of just one industry, and I'm going to give you a choice of three, which would you choose? Big oil, big banking, or perhaps big bovine, the cattle industry. If you could tweak one of those business models ever so slightly, which one would it be? There's a company called Discovery. You may have heard of them. They've got a global wellness program called Vitality. It's got 40 million members in 40 countries across 22 different insurance businesses around the world. Now, Vitality employs actuaries. Actuaries are not necessarily always the life and soul of the party, but what they are is extraordinarily clever. And they can extrapolate possible outcomes using highfalutin mathematics. And what these actuaries have done is that they have modeled the future for their customers to help their customers make better choices in terms of their health. If you can incentivize somebody to forego the pizza and rather have the broccoli, that's something of a miracle work. If you can say to somebody, yes, you've had a bite of the donut, but rather choose the apple, how many of us, quite frankly, right now in this room would make that choice? Well, you might make that choice if you understood that the donut was going to have terrible long-term consequences for your health, yet you're still going to eat the donut. But if you're going to be incentivized with a reward for exercising, for eating more healthily, for giving the data on your wearable device to the health provider so that they can better model their risk into the future, they can give you a reward. And over time, perhaps you can exercise that reward in a fantasy holiday at some point. Now, if we can change human behavior as Vitality is showing worldwide it can do when it comes to healthcare, surely those same A-type personalities who are adopting these measures could also be incentivized to change their corporate behavior, to change environmental outcomes. So I'm going to suggest to you that if we tweaked banking just a little bit, we may get better climate outcomes. Now, I know what you're thinking. These are the bad guys. These are the guys at the epicenter of a voracious capitalism that since before the Industrial Revolution has sought to extract rather than add. But if you want to find somebody who is completely motivated for profit, you're not going to find anybody better than a banker. If you could get global regulators and regulators in countries around the world to alter ever so slightly the capital requirements of banks, which understandably were tightened up after the financial crisis through the huge misdemeanor, misbehavior, and criminal activity of the financial system up until that point, but tweak it just a little bit so that they could in turn provide performance incentive loans to large corporations, perhaps we may start seeing this wonderful butterfly effect of gains around the world. The global poster child for running business in a sustainable fashion, of course, is Patagonia. This campaign, "Don't Buy This Jacket," was designed to draw attention to the fact that the fast fashion industry was putting millions of tons of clothing into landfill every year. People would wear items 2 or 3 times and would then dispose of them. What Patagonia was drawing attention to was the fact that it produced better quality clothing that would last longer and that would have less impact on the environment. Ironically, or perhaps deliberately, this ad campaign led to a 30% increase in sales of that particular jacket. And when Yvon Chouinard, who is the founder of Patagonia, discovered himself on the Forbes list of dollar billionaires, courtesy of his activism and work in fashion, he was so appalled that he gave away the business into a trust. And the business earns about $100 million a year in profits. That trust is using that $100 million a year in perpetuity to fight climate change. So why is the world's most progressive company on climate change so dystopian in its view? We're all screwed, reads this ad from Patagonia. So don't tell us we can imagine a healthy future, because the reality is it's too late to fix the climate crisis. And we don't trust anyone who says we need to demand a livable planet because we don't have a choice. Makes you want to slit your wrists. There's a little small print over there. The small print's always important in these things. It says, now read it backwards. It's challenging us to look at the climate issue differently. Because we don't have a choice, we need to demand a livable future. We don't trust anyone that it's too late to fix the climate crisis, because the reality is we can imagine a healthy future. So don't tell us we're all screwed. Sometimes the problems that we try to solve in the same way over and over and over again need to be turned upside down. Large corporations, by their very nature, all have significant carbon footprints. How do we get them to reduce their carbon footprints? You incentivize them with money to do so. If you're a large supermarket chain, for example, you have a whole logistical enterprise. You bring in your broccoli from Kenya, you grow your apples in Spain, your oranges in South Africa, wherever it might be. And because of consumer demand around the world, all of this stuff is supplied 24/7, 365 days a year. So let's not pretend that we're not involved in this. We're as guilty as the retailers themselves, because we demand avos 365 days a year, because that's the way we become wired. If these big, large supermarket groups, for example, could be incentivized through the loans, and they all raise money from time to time for growth and expansion and for new projects, if they could be incentivized with a cheaper cost of capital, provided, of course, they then police the downward chain of their suppliers, perhaps, just perhaps, we would start seeing a change in behavior. We could start seeing ourselves being pulled back from the brink. And perhaps Wall Street, the evil Wall Street, could play a critical role in it. The nasty money grabbers of the world could provide an incentive. This stuff is remarkable. It is a rare seaweed that grows on the ocean floor. This particular seaweed is useful in cattle feed. Cattle are, by all of the evidence that we know, quite windy. And they need to become less windy. There are 1.5 billion cattle alive in the world at any one time. Now, the activists will tell you we need to do away with industrial farming, and that is a noble goal, but it's not something that's going to happen soon. Perhaps the supermarket groups could encourage the inclusion of seaweed derivatives in cattle feed. Perhaps that is one solution. Except you don't want to be stripping the seabed, which is why Australian researchers for the last decades have been working on synthetic alternatives. And there is science to show that it reduces the amount of methane that is exuded by cattle in feedlots. It's not a great life for these animals, of course, but it is the way in which the agricultural complex works at the moment. And if we could begin that process of incentivizing through the value chain a different kind of behavior, we may start seeing different outcomes. Yes, big banking could make all the difference in the world. If Edwin Sabuhoro had simply gone to COP 1 through 27 and lobbied year in and year out for better outcomes in terms of poaching, if he'd gone to government meetings once a quarter and said, government, we need to change the way in which we are fighting the poaching problem, right now we would have no gorillas in the mountains. He acted. He took a different path. He took a different step. He took a courageous step. And frankly, we're running out of time. The temperatures are rising. We've lost the fight against 1.5%. All of the evidence shows land and sea temperatures are rising. Just recently, there were statistics showing that we're reaching the highest averages ever. We have to think differently about this crisis. We have to approach this crisis differently, and we have to be courageous. And sometimes the best way to fight a problem is to use human nature, which is short-term in its focus, to get better long-term outcomes. Guerrilla tactics, perhaps, are a better approach. Thank you very much indeed.